In the gray light of early morning, a quiet cul-de-sac in the outskirts of Sacramento is suddenly fractured by the low growl of approaching engines. A caravan of unmarked SUVs glides to a stop, their black paint catching the shimmer of the first thin rays. Doors swing open. Heavy boots hit the pavement in unison. The air, still chilled from the night, carries the faint metallic scent of dew on asphalt. Somewhere down the street, a dog barks once, then goes silent. From behind curtained windows, neighbors peer out, their silhouettes just barely visible. The red and blue pulse from concealed police light bars flashes against the glass, painting rooms in momentary bursts of warning color. Every few seconds, the muted voice of a team leader cuts through the tension, issuing clipped commands that the rest follow without hesitation. On the third vehicle's right side, a woman in tactical gear steps forward, one gloved hand resting on the grip of her holstered sidearm. Her eyes scan the target house, a one-story home with a small porch, flower pots wilting under weeks of neglect. The porch light is still on, casting a pale cone over the chipped welcome mat. Inside, a figure moves behind frosted glass. The team closes in. The door opens a crack, a voice muffled but uneasy asking what's going on. In seconds, the door is pushed wide. The man who appears is in his mid-70s, hair thin to white, wearing a faded brown sweater over pajama pants. His eyes dart left and right, as though seeking a familiar face among the strangers surrounding his home. Before he can speak again, the lead officer steps in, announces his name, and tells him he is under arrest for the murder of a woman in Sacramento, a murder committed more than 50 years ago. For a moment, the man stands frozen, as though the words themselves cannot find a place to land. His mouth opens slightly, but no sound emerges. A neighbor, a woman in her 60s clutching a robe tight around her frame, watches from across the street. She cannot reconcile the man she has known for years, polite, quiet, offering a wave every Tuesday morning, with the man now having his hands pulled behind his back. The steel of the handcuffs clicks shut, the sound sharp and final against the low hum of the street. As officers guide him down the steps, the neighbor catches his eyes for a fleeting second. She will later describe them as hollow, as if already looking somewhere far away. The sun is just cresting the rooftops now, and its glare catches the lenses of the cameras stationed discreetly at the end of the block, waiting to capture this moment. Inside the lead SUV, the man sits rigid, his wrists bound, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Outside, a plainclothes investigator leans against the hood of his car, flipping through a folder thick with photographs and reports that have yellowed with time. At the very top, clipped in place, is a single, high-resolution image taken only weeks ago, a forensic reconstruction of a microscopic sample recovered in 1970. Under the fingernails of a young woman brutally murdered in her apartment, investigators had found traces of skin and blood. At the time, it meant little. Today, it means everything. In the quiet between the movement of vehicles and the crackle of radios, there's the faint sound of a helicopter in the distance. Somewhere in the city, life is proceeding as normal, commuters merging onto freeways, coffee shops opening their doors, unaware that in this small corner of Sacramento, the end of a story decades in the making has finally begun. The forensic report in that folder contains a DNA match. It is irrefutable. It points to the man now sitting silently in the backseat, his reflection broken into fragments by the reinforced glass. Half a century ago, his name never appeared in the investigation files. He was never questioned, never considered. The case had stalled, and over time the city forgot. But the evidence never did. That tiny fragment of skin, invisible to the naked eye, had been waiting in the darkness of an evidence vault, untouched, unchanged, holding onto a name no one knew they were looking for. And now, in 2025, technology has finally caught up with the truth it carried. Investigators will say later that the DNA profile emerged so clearly. It was like a voice speaking after decades of silence. It cut through every false lead, every dead end, and landed with precision on a single identity. But in this moment, as the last of the vehicles roll away from the curb and the flashing lights fade into daylight, the only thing left on this street is the unease that lingers when the familiar suddenly reveals itself as dangerous. Neighbors close their curtains, but their minds remain open, replaying every brief encounter, every small kindness, now under a new and chilling light. In the days to come, Sacramento will learn the full weight of what happened. They will hear about the night in 1970 when a young woman's life ended behind a second-story door. They will revisit photographs of a crime scene preserved in the brittle tones of old film. They will be told that the man they thought they knew was living with this secret for more than 50 years. But there is one question that no press conference, no forensic breakthrough, and no arrest can answer in a single morning. Why him? Why now? And why did it take half a century for a sliver of evidence to speak? That answer begins not with the arrest you've just witnessed, but with a night in Sacramento when the air was cold, the streets were quiet, and one open balcony door set into motion a chain of events no one would understand until it was far too late. October in Sacramento carried a certain stillness, the kind that seemed to press against the walls of every building and seep into the bones of the people who lived there. By the middle of the month, the air was dry but cool, carrying the faint smell of fallen leaves beginning to decay on neatly trimmed lawns. In the courthouse district, the trees lining the streets were shedding yellow and brown foliage, scattering them across the sidewalks and into the gutters where the wind pushed them in slow, scraping swirls. On the evening of October 25, 1970, a pale orange glow clung to the horizon before fading into a deep blue sky, the kind that hinted at the early arrival of winter nights. In a second-story apartment just 2 blocks from the Sacramento County Courthouse, a warm light shone through thin curtains. The faint hum of an AM radio drifted through the slightly open balcony door, its tinny speaker playing a mellow jazz standard popular at the time. Inside, Laura Mitchell sat at her kitchen table, a neat stack of court files beside her, each bound with string and marked with the date for an upcoming trial. At 28, she had built a reputation in the courthouse for her precision and quiet efficiency, the kind of clerk who could spot an error in a deposition before the attorney had finished reading it aloud. Laura lived alone, and by all accounts she liked it that way. Neighbors described her as polite but reserved, the sort who exchanged greetings in the hallway without offering much more. Her friends said she kept her personal life light, preferring the comfort of her apartment and the company of books over the noise of downtown nightlife. That Sunday night was meant to be no different, a quiet evening of work in preparation for the next day. At 10:45 p.m., a neighbor in the building directly across the courtyard noticed Laura's balcony door still open, sheer curtains swaying gently in the breeze. He thought little of it. Sacramento evenings in October were mild, and many residents left their windows open to let the cool air in. But around 11 p.m., another tenant on the same floor reported hearing faint, deliberate footsteps on Laura's balcony. Not the quick rhythm of someone stepping outside for fresh air, but slower, more measured, as though each movement was testing the space. She assumed it was Laura herself, perhaps stepping out to adjust something, and didn't think to look. What happened next would remain obscured by time and silence for decades. The AM radio kept playing, oblivious to the change in the room's atmosphere. Somewhere between the stacks of court files and the open balcony door, an intrusion took place, one that began with proximity and ended in violence. By Monday morning, the courthouse was preparing for a full docket, and Laura's absence was immediately noticed. When she failed to arrive by 9 a.m., her supervisor called her apartment. The phone rang unanswered. By 9:30, the building's manager, carrying a spare key, knocked on her door. The knock echoed through the hallway, unanswered but heavy with the awareness that something wasn't right. When the door swung open, the air inside was cool but tinged with the metallic tang of fresh blood. Sunlight streamed in through the balcony door, casting bright rectangles across the living room floor and into the kitchen. The AM radio had gone silent, its dial still lit but its speaker producing nothing but a faint electrical hiss. In the bedroom, the scene was frozen in a grim stillness. Laura lay on the carpet beside her bed, her hair spread in a fan across the floor, her clothes disheveled, her skin already paling in the morning light. Multiple stab wounds marked her torso, each precise yet frenzied, a contradiction that would trouble investigators for years. There were defensive injuries on her arms and deep scratches along her hands, suggesting she had fought back with everything she had. The forensic technician who arrived later would record faint traces of what looked like skin under her fingernails, mixed with her own blood. It was collected and sealed in a small envelope, labeled with the date and case number, then stored away with the rest of the evidence. In 1970, such a sample could be examined for blood type at best. DNA as an investigative tool was still more than a decade away from even being imagined in a courtroom. The balcony door remained open, its frame unmarked by forced entry. Outside, the second-story ledge extended toward the adjacent apartment, making it possible for someone to cross over without using the front entrance. On the balcony railing, a single smudge of something dark was visible but too faint to confirm as blood. Neighbors gathered in small knots near the entrance to the building as police worked inside. They whispered to one another, voices low, their eyes repeatedly glancing toward the second-floor windows. The building's courtyard, normally filled with the smell of fresh-cut grass and the distant chatter of radios or televisions, now felt stripped of sound and scent, overtaken by the sterile presence of law enforcement. The lead investigator that morning made a note in his log: victim last seen alive evening prior, likely time of death between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. It was a narrow window, but it left too many possibilities. No signs of robbery, no sexual assault confirmed at the scene, no forced entry through the main door. The only irregularity was the open balcony, a detail that would be both an early clue and an enduring mystery. By late afternoon, Laura's body had been transported to the county morgue, the apartment cordoned off with police tape. The manager locked the front door, his hands trembling slightly as he turned the key. Inside, the smell of antiseptic and dried blood lingered in the air, clinging to the walls and to the fibers of the carpet. For the detectives assigned to the case, it was the beginning of an investigation that promised complexity. For the community, it was the abrupt end of the illusion that this quiet stretch of Sacramento was untouched by the kind of violence they read about in larger cities. People began locking their doors earlier in the evening, drawing their curtains tight, and avoiding the courtyard after dark. What no one could have predicted then was that the most valuable piece of evidence had already been collected and sealed in an unremarkable paper envelope, placed in the corner of an evidence vault. Its significance, invisible in 1970, would not come into focus until half a century later, when the science finally caught up to the secret it held. And on that quiet October morning, as police packed up their gear and the building settled back into uneasy silence, no one standing in that courtyard could have known that the true story of Laura Mitchell's last night was far from over. In the first 48 hours after Laura Mitchell's body was found, Sacramento police worked under the assumption that the killer was someone she knew. The narrow window of time, the absence of forced entry at the front door, and the victim's profession within the courthouse all pointed investigators toward her inner circle. By noon on October 26, detectives had compiled a short list of potential suspects. At the top was her former boyfriend, a man she had broken up with just 3 months earlier. He was brought in for questioning before the day was over, seated under the harsh fluorescent lights of the interrogation room. He admitted they had argued in the past, but he denied any contact with her in recent weeks. His alibi placed him at a card game with friends on the night of the murder, and each one confirmed his presence. The detectives kept him in the file but quietly moved on. Their next focus was a male colleague from the courthouse, someone who had reportedly walked her home a few times in the past. He was cooperative but defensive, pointing out that anyone in her building could have seen her working late that night. He allowed them to search his apartment, his car, even his laundry hamper. Nothing tied him to the crime. Despite this, the investigation remained locked on the theory of a personal connection. The idea of a stranger climbing onto her balcony in a quiet part of the city seemed improbable to them. Forensics in 1970 offered few advantages. Crime scene technicians recovered a partial shoe print from the carpet near the bedroom door, the pattern faint, distorted by the pile, and too incomplete to link to any specific brand. They also collected a single light-colored hair from the bedsheet. It did not match Laura's. Without the ability to run it through a database or perform DNA analysis, the hair became just another piece of physical evidence without context. In the language of the time, it was of possible investigative value, but in practice, it sat in an envelope alongside dozens of others. The press seized on the balcony detail, giving the case a name that would follow it for decades: the balcony murder. Reporters sketched the second-story apartment in black ink for the front pages, arrows showing the open door, the ledge connecting to the neighboring unit, the narrow drop to the courtyard below. Each retelling in the newspapers subtly exaggerated the daring of the intrusion, turning it into a near-mythical break-in. But this public framing had an unintended effect. People assumed the killer must have been agile, possibly young, possibly male. It was an image that narrowed the scope of the search and reinforced the police's early focus on certain profiles while ignoring others. Behind closed doors, the forensic team faced a more damaging problem. The biological evidence collected from under Laura's fingernails was stored according to standard procedures of the day, sealed in paper envelopes and kept at room temperature in a secure cabinet. In the absence of climate control, small fluctuations in temperature and humidity over the years would later degrade the quality of that material. At the time, no one foresaw a future in which such a sample could hold the key to solving the case. To the detectives in 1970, it was a backup detail, not the cornerstone it would one day become. As weeks passed, the investigation began to lose momentum. Detectives re-interviewed neighbors, asking again about noises, about lights, about anyone unfamiliar in the courtyard that night. The responses were the same. No one had seen a stranger. No one had noticed anything suspicious apart from those unconfirmed footsteps on the balcony. Without a confession, without a weapon, and without new evidence, every lead circled back to the same dead ends. Internally, there was tension in the department. Some younger officers believed the case demanded a broader net, door-to-door canvassing in surrounding blocks, questioning transient populations, comparing the method to similar crimes in other counties. The older detectives resisted, arguing that expanding the search without probable cause would spread resources too thin. This divide created a subtle paralysis, where neither approach was pursued with full force. By January 1971, public interest had cooled. The local paper moved the case from the front page to a small column on the second, noting that no new developments have emerged. Within the courthouse, whispers about the murder faded into the background noise of daily business. New cases, new trials, new crimes took their place. For the Mitchell family, the silence was unbearable. They visited the station every few weeks, sitting in the lobby until a detective would come out to speak with them. Each time the answer was the same: the case was still open, still active, but there was nothing new to report. The mother's questions grew sharper. Why was no one arrested? Why had the hair not led anywhere? Why had they not searched further? She never got the answers she wanted. The official report from early 1971 shows the slow death of the investigation in writing. The suspect list dwindled to 2 names, both already vetted extensively. The evidence inventory remained unchanged. No additional witnesses came forward. A final note from the lead detective reads simply, "All available leads exhausted, pending further information." In reality, the decision to scale back was less about exhaustion and more about probability. Without a new break, the likelihood of solving the crime diminished with each passing week. Homicide detectives were reassigned to fresher cases with better odds. The balcony murder file was placed in a brown cardboard box, its label handwritten in black marker. It was carried to the records room and slotted into a metal shelving unit alongside dozens of other unsolved cases. The air in that room was dry, tinged with the faint smell of dust and paper. The box sat there, motionless, as years would pass. In its depths lay photographs beginning to fade, typed reports with ink smudged from hasty signatures, and an unremarkable paper envelope containing the scrapings from beneath Laura's fingernails. That envelope, like the rest of the evidence, was out of sight, out of mind. By the spring of 1971, the Mitchell family stopped visiting the station as often. The quiet acknowledgement had set in the case was no longer active. Sacramento moved on. The second-story apartment was eventually rented to a new tenant. Neighbors who had spoken to police stopped mentioning the murder in casual conversation. But evidence does not move on. It waits. It waits in silence, in forgotten storage rooms, surviving on the chance that one day, technology or luck will breathe life back into it. And in a locked cabinet in Sacramento, a name was waiting too. A name no one would connect to Laura Mitchell for more than 50 years. The years after Laura Mitchell's death passed in slow increments for her family. Every birthday, every holiday, every family gathering was marked by an empty space at the table and the knowledge that her killer had never been found. Her mother, who had once called the police station every month for updates, began making fewer calls as the decades wore on. Not because the grief had faded, but because each conversation ended in the same place, with polite voices telling her there was nothing new to share. By the late 1980s, her voice had grown softer on the phone, her questions shorter, her pauses longer. She died in 1991 without ever learning who had taken her daughter's life. The apartment building where Laura lived never recovered from its sudden infamy. Word traveled quickly among renters in Sacramento, and the complex developed a quiet reputation as a place to avoid. Units that came available sat vacant for months, their empty windows reflecting the seasonal changes outside, spring blossoms giving way to summer glare, then the brittle yellow leaves of autumn, each cycle passing over rooms that no one wanted to enter. The few tenants who stayed long-term spoke in lowered voices about the night of the murder, as though saying her name aloud might invite something unwanted back into their lives. Over time, the building's hallways took on a different atmosphere, one of neglect rather than community. The smell of fresh paint was replaced by the must of closed spaces, and the sound of neighborly conversation in the courtyard was replaced by the hum of distant traffic. Detectives came and went, each inheriting the case with a sense of obligation, each eventually passing it on to the next when nothing new emerged. By the late 1970s, the file had been pulled from storage twice. Once in 1977, when a man arrested for a series of assaults in a nearby county claimed to have information about an old balcony stabbing. And again in 1983, when a prisoner in federal custody offered to trade confessions for a reduced sentence. In both instances, investigators conducted interviews, reviewed details, and compared statements to the evidence on file. In both, the information fell apart under scrutiny. The 1977 suspect had been incarcerated at the time of Laura's death. The 1983 informant had invented details easily found in newspaper archives, but failed to describe the interior of her apartment accurately. Each failed lead carried a cost. For the detectives, it was the erosion of energy, the slow acceptance that the case might never be solved. For the community, It was a renewal of the quiet fear that someone capable of such violence had walked away unnoticed and unpunished. The case became something people only mentioned in passing, as a piece of local lore, a story for new tenants, a warning to keep doors locked, a reminder that sometimes the truth doesn't come out. In 1996, the file surfaced again when advances in forensic science allowed for more sensitive DNA testing. The samples from under Laura's fingernails were re-examined, but the results were inconclusive. Decades of storage under less than ideal conditions had degraded the material, leaving scientists with only partial profiles. Those partials were run through the national database, but no match was found. The test was recorded in the case file as an investigative step completed negative result, and the box returned to its shelf. By the early 2000s, the building where Laura had lived underwent renovations. Fresh paint covered the aging walls, new carpet muffled footsteps in the hallways, and modern light fixtures brightened spaces that had been dim for years. But for the families who had lived there in 1970, no cosmetic changes could erase the memory of the night she died. The second-story apartment remained a point of subtle avoidance, even when new tenants moved in unaware of its history. In 2010, another lead surfaced when a retired federal investigator contacted Sacramento police. He believed a man he had once surveilled for a series of burglaries in the Bay Area might have been in Sacramento the weekend Laura was killed. The man fit the general age and build described by one witness who had heard footsteps on the balcony, but cross-referenced travel records placed him hundreds of miles away at the time. The lead collapsed within days. For the Mitchell family, these cycles of hope and disappointment became familiar. Each time a new detective called, they braced for the possibility of closure, only to feel the same quiet letdown when the call ended. The frustration was not just that the killer had evaded justice, but that so much of Laura's life, her habits, her routines, the small details that made her unique, had been reduced to bullet points in a file. Then, in 2015, the case shifted. Detective Marisol Vega, a recent transfer to the cold case unit, was assigned Laura's file as part of her new caseload. She approached it with the methodical patience of someone accustomed to starting at the beginning. She read every page, examined every photograph, and reviewed every interview transcript, even those that other detectives had long since dismissed. One night, sitting alone in the unit's file room with the dim hum of the building's air conditioning in the background, Vega noticed something in an early witness statement that didn't align. A neighbor had told police they heard Laura's AM radio playing at a specific time, just before 11 p.m., and had made a point to mention that the program changed from music to a late-night talk segment. Yet in a separate statement, another neighbor recalled hearing music from Laura's apartment closer to midnight. At first glance, it seemed like the usual fog of memory. But Vega knew that in 1970, most local stations kept strict programming schedules, and a time discrepancy could mean something else entirely. She marked the page with a sticky note and wrote a question to herself. 2 witnesses, 2 different times. Why? It was a small detail, easy to dismiss, the kind of inconsistency that had been overlooked before. But Vega understood that in cold cases, progress often began with something that didn't fit. A detail buried in conflicting testimony could be a key, especially if it pointed to a window of opportunity that no one had previously considered. Outside the file room, the city had moved on from the murder long ago. The courthouse was busier than ever, the apartment building now home to tenants who had never heard Laura's name. But inside that room, under the flickering fluorescent light, one detective was beginning to see the case in a way no one else had, and the question forming in her mind was not just about time. It was about whether the music that night had been playing for Laura at all. Detective Marisol Vega knew that reopening a case this old meant accepting the weight of every failure that had come before her. She started with the evidence index, tracing her finger down the list until she reached the small paper envelope marked fingernail scrapings. It had been collected on the morning of October 26, 1970, sealed, catalogued, and stored. Decades of heat, cold, and fluctuating humidity had likely weakened whatever biological material it once held. But with the right technology, even fragments could speak. Vega reached out to a private forensic laboratory known for pushing techniques beyond what most public agencies could afford. The lead analyst suggested a method rarely applied to samples this old: YSDR analysis, a process that isolates male-specific genetic markers. It was a gamble. There was a chance the sample would yield nothing but degraded strands too damaged to interpret. There was also the possibility that what it revealed could finally name the man who had stepped onto Laura Mitchell's balcony that night. The lab's sterile room smelled faintly of ethanol and ozone, the air cool and dry to protect sensitive equipment. Vega stood behind the glass wall of the observation area, watching as a technician in a white coat opened the envelope with careful precision. Under magnification, the material looked like dust. The technician worked in silence, the only sound the rhythmic click of instruments and the faint hum of a filtration system. Days stretched into weeks as the sample went through extraction, amplification, and analysis. Then, in an email sent at 7:12 a.m. on a Monday, the lab confirmed it. A complete male DNA profile had been recovered. It was clean, uncontaminated, and ready to be compared against the National CODIS database. Vega held her breath as the system searched millions of profiles in law enforcement records. No match. The man's DNA was not in any criminal database in the country. A dead end for some detectives. But Vega knew the absence of a match didn't mean the trail had gone cold again. It meant she would have to take the longer path, forensic genealogy. Using the YSDR markers, the lab began building a genetic network, identifying distant relatives whose DNA had been voluntarily submitted to public genealogy sites. It was a slow, meticulous process, tracing lines of ancestry backward through generations, linking second cousins to third cousins, filling in branches of a family tree that spanned continents. The breakthrough came from a single branch, a cluster of individuals with deep Irish ancestry, their family records showing a migration to California in the late 1940s. One family in particular had lived in Sacramento in 1970, just blocks from Laura's apartment. Vega followed the paper trail, property records, birth certificates, old employment files. It led her to the most surprising connection yet. A retired county sheriff's deputy, still living in the area, was a close genetic match to the unknown profile. His relationship to the source of the DNA was distant, but it placed the killer within a very specific family circle. It was the kind of finding that made investigators uneasy. The retired deputy had never been connected to the case, but his career and position meant that, at some point, he could have influenced the original investigation. If the killer was a relative, it was possible, even likely, that bias, whether conscious or not, had kept that person off the suspect list. Vega kept the discovery quiet, looping in only her immediate supervisor and the lab. She knew the implications of suggesting that law enforcement, even decades ago, might have overlooked or shielded someone connected to one of their own. The genealogical tree was mapped in greater detail, narrowing the field. By late summer, it came down to 3 men, all in their 70s, all with Sacramento ties in 1970. 2 were ruled out quickly. One had been overseas in military service during the time of the murder, the other in a hospital recovering from surgery. That left a single name, one that had never appeared in any investigative document over the past 45 years: Thomas Keating. Keating had been 25 in 1970, living in an apartment complex across from Laura's building. He had worked as a maintenance laborer, a job that would have given him access to tools, ladders, and the knowledge of how to move quietly through residential spaces. His name was absent from every police report, every witness statement. No one had ever questioned him. Vega pulled his employment history, noting that he had left Sacramento abruptly in early 1971, moving to Oregon, where he stayed for the rest of his life. Public records painted a picture of an ordinary man, steady employment, marriage, children, eventual retirement. There was nothing in his official history to suggest violence, but the DNA told a different story. She stared at his photo from a 1970 driver's license renewal, grainy and washed out, but still showing the set of his jaw, the curl of his hair, the eyes that now stared back at her from decades in the past. Somewhere behind those eyes was the answer to the question that had haunted the Mitchell family for half a century. It was no longer a question of whether Thomas Keating was involved. It was a question of how to approach him without alerting him to the weight of the evidence now bearing down. Vega knew that the moment he realized he was a suspect, any chance to collect confirmatory DNA without a warrant could vanish. Her plan would require patience. She began tracking his routines, noting where he shopped, where he walked, where he paused for coffee. The goal was simple: find an opportunity to collect something he touched, something he discarded that could be analyzed without his knowledge. In the cold case unit's conference room, the genetic tree remained tacked to the wall, lines of ink connecting distant cousins, branching out from a single name written in red. Underneath, in Vega's handwriting, was a date circled twice, the day she planned to make her move. The original investigation had never looked in his direction. Now, everything pointed toward him. And in a case where evidence had waited more than 5 decades to be heard, it was finally time to see if the DNA that had survived under Laura Mitchell's fingernails could speak his name aloud. Thomas Keating's name sat at the center of the board in the cold case unit, circled in red ink. Detective Marisol Vega knew she could not take it to the district attorney on genealogical evidence alone. She needed a direct sample, something that would stand in court and erase any doubt. But before she could move, she had to know who he really was. The records painted an odd contrast. In 1970, Keating had been a maintenance worker at the apartment complex directly across from Laura Mitchell's building. His job required him to fix locks, replace windows, and occasionally climb onto second-story ledges to clean or make repairs. Residents from that period recalled him faintly, describing a young man who spoke little, kept his head down, and completed his work without lingering. There were no police reports against him, no visible blemishes on his record. Vega dug deeper, combing through crime reports from the year of Laura's murder. 2 unsolved break-ins caught her attention. Both occurred within a 6-block radius of Laura's home. Both involved a second-story balcony entry, and in both cases the intruder had fled without taking anything when confronted by the occupants. Neither case had been linked to Laura's murder at the time, but the similarities in method were difficult to ignore. The suspect descriptions from those reports were vague: a man in his 20s, medium build, dark hair, but they aligned with Keating's appearance in 1970. What troubled Vega most was how quickly Keating had left Sacramento. Employment records showed that by February 1971, only 3 months after Laura's death, he had relocated to Oregon. From then on, his life appeared almost unnervingly ordinary. He married, had 2 children, and stayed with the same manufacturing company for over 30 years until retirement. Neighbors in Oregon described him as dependable, quiet, the type to shovel snow from the sidewalks of elderly residents without being asked. He also volunteered. In the late 1990s, he joined a faith-based construction group that traveled to small towns to build homes and community centers. In one archived newsletter from the group, Vega found a photograph of Keating standing beside another volunteer. The caption named him Michael Mitchell, Laura's older brother. The realization tightened something in her chest. The 2 men had spent weeks working side by side, building a playground for children in a rural Oregon town. Michael had shaken the hand of the man who, decades earlier, had stood on his sister's balcony. Vega considered the psychology of it. Some killers avoided any connection to the victim's family. Others, especially those confident they would never be caught, drew closer, taking satisfaction in their invisibility. Whether Keating's involvement in that project was coincidence or calculation, she could not yet say. But the image of them together, the grieving brother and the hidden suspect, was a reminder of just how completely Keating had blended into the fabric of ordinary life. To move forward, Vega arranged discreet surveillance. For days, an unmarked vehicle watched Keating's routines. Morning walks to a small park, grocery runs, the occasional stop at a coffee shop. He was careful in ways that might have seemed unremarkable to anyone else, never littering, always placing any trash directly into public bins, often carrying a reusable water bottle instead of disposable cups. She needed something he would discard without thought. On the sixth day, he sat on a park bench under a stand of maple trees, sipping from a plastic water bottle he had purchased from a nearby kiosk. He read a newspaper for nearly an hour, occasionally glancing up at children playing on the swings. When he finished the bottle, he capped it and set it beside him on the bench before standing and walking away. Vega's team moved in minutes later, collecting it with gloved hands, sealing it in an evidence bag. The bottle went straight to the lab. Technicians swabbed the mouth of the bottle, the rim of the cap, the grooves where saliva might have transferred. The wait was shorter this time, 2 days. On the afternoon of the second day, Vega received the call. The voice on the other end was calm, but the words carried weight. The DNA from the bottle matched with complete certainty the male profile recovered from under Laura Mitchell's fingernails. 52 years of uncertainty collapsed into a single line on a lab report. Match probability, 1 in 1, 5 quintillion. There was no longer room for coincidence, no plausible alternative explanation. The same man who had walked the park in quiet anonymity was the man who had stood in Laura's bedroom on that October night. Vega printed the report and placed it beside the old crime scene photographs. The juxtaposition was almost surreal, a grainy black and white image of a young man in a work shirt, and a crisp, color photo of an elderly man in a zip-up sweater holding a grocery bag. Decades apart, but the same genetic code, the same unbroken thread from crime to capture. The arrest would require timing and precision. Keating had lived a long time with his secret. She could not predict how he might react when it was finally confronted. But the certainty was there now, written in data that no courtroom could dismiss. And as the plans took shape, Vega could not ignore one last question. After all these years, would he admit what he had done, or would the truth have to be pieced together without his voice at all? The interrogation room was quiet enough to hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Thomas Keating sat in a metal chair, his back straight but his shoulders slightly hunched forward. The table between him and Detective Marisol Vega was bare except for a single folder. Inside was the lab report, the one that connected him, beyond any statistical doubt, to the DNA recovered from beneath Laura Mitchell's fingernails in 1970. Vega placed the folder on the table without opening it. She leaned back in her chair, studying him. His hands were folded neatly, fingers intertwined, as though he were holding them together to keep them from trembling. For 4 minutes, neither of them spoke. Keating kept his gaze fixed on the table's surface, his breathing slow and measured, his eyes blinking at long intervals. The silence stretched, deliberate and heavy. When he finally looked up, his voice was low, almost flat. She wasn't supposed to be there. The words hung in the air, neither a confession nor a denial, but the first crack in a wall he had maintained for over half a century. He began to speak in fragments, as if sorting through memories he had kept locked away. He told them he had been drinking that night, alone in his apartment. He had decided to cross into Laura's building, intending to take valuables from an empty unit. He claimed he thought her apartment was unoccupied until he saw her. According to his account, she had confronted him near the bedroom. She fought back, clawing at his face and arms. In that moment, he said, panic took over. He pulled a knife from his jacket, the blade something he carried from his maintenance work, and lashed out. Forensic evidence collected in 1970 aligned with this description. The defensive wounds on Laura's arms, the pattern of scratches along her attacker's forearms, and the depth of the stab wounds all supported a sudden escalation rather than a prolonged assault. The DNA under her fingernails was consistent with a desperate struggle, her final act leaving behind the only trace that could one day name her killer. Vega listened without interrupting. Keating's tone never shifted, even when describing the moment he realized she was dead. There was no visible remorse, no hesitation. Psychologists later noted that his account reflected a classic opportunistic offender, someone without a fixed plan for violence, but with a willingness to use it when confronted. The alcohol may have lowered his inhibitions, but the underlying traits, risk-taking, control over his own narrative, and the ability to compartmentalize, were long-standing. Then came a detail that had never been in the case file. Keating admitted that several days after the murder, he returned to the scene. He stood on the grass in the courtyard below Laura's apartment and looked up at the balcony. He said he wanted to see if anyone could tell. In 1970, a neighbor had reported seeing an unfamiliar man doing exactly that, but the statement was dismissed as unreliable. Hearing Keating describe it now, with no knowledge of that old witness account, locked the moment into the timeline with unsettling precision. Vega asked him why he had left Sacramento so quickly afterward. He said he could feel the investigation pressing in, even though no one had questioned him. It was just better to start over somewhere else, he said. He offered nothing further about his decades in Oregon, except to acknowledge that he had thought about that night often. When the interview ended, he was booked on a charge of first-degree murder. The arrest made headlines across Sacramento, reviving a case that had been silent for so long that most residents under 50 had never heard of it. At trial, prosecutors laid out the forensic evidence in painstaking detail. They showed the jury how the DNA profile had been extracted, how the genealogical search had narrowed to Keating, and how the discarded water bottle had confirmed the match. They projected photographs of Laura's apartment, the balcony, the envelope of fingernail scrapings stored for decades in the evidence vault. Each piece built toward the moment the lab report was read into the record. Keating's defense offered no alternative explanation for the DNA, focusing instead on his age, his health, and the claim that the killing had been the result of fear rather than intent. The jury was unmoved. On the final day before sentencing, the judge invited Keating to speak. The courtroom was silent as he rose. He looked toward the Mitchell family seated in the front row. His expression did not change. He said nothing. No apology, no explanation beyond what he had already given. After a few seconds, he sat back down. The family left the courtroom quietly, their steps measured, their faces unreadable to those watching. Outside, the autumn air was cool, and the courthouse steps were lined with reporters. But the Mitchells moved past them without a word, carrying with them the truth they had sought for decades, and the silence of the man who had taken so much from them. And in the end, that silence seemed to speak louder than any confession ever could. When the verdict was read, the courtroom seemed to exhale as one. For the Mitchell family, it was the first time in more than 50 years that the question of who had killed Laura was no longer met with silence or speculation. Outside the courthouse, the air was cool and sharp with the scent of rain on concrete. Reporters clustered near the steps, their microphones catching fragments of statements from officials. The family kept their distance, moving together in a tight formation toward the waiting car. In the days that followed, the headlines framed the case as a triumph of persistence and science. For Sacramento law enforcement, it became proof that forensic genealogy could do more than solve current crimes. It could reach back into history, past every failed lead and false start, to pull a name from the shadows. Funding was approved for dedicated genealogical analysis in the cold case unit. Other families, still living with unanswered questions, began calling in, asking if their cases could be next. But for Laura's relatives, justice was complicated. At a small gathering in her sister's home, they spoke quietly about the trial. There was relief in knowing the truth, but no one pretended it erased the years in between. One family member said simply, "It's not closure, it's a conclusion." The words lingered in the room, heavier than the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. Detective Marisol Vega filed the final report with an attention to detail that mirrored her first day on the case. In the evidence section, the envelope containing the fingernail scrapings was listed alongside a note, "Retained for archival purposes." It would remain in storage, preserved as both evidence and reminder, a small fragment of a life that had refused to be silenced. In a locked cell at the county detention facility, Thomas Keating adjusted to the rhythm of confinement. The clang of metal doors, the echo of footsteps in narrow corridors, the faint scent of disinfectant, all of it replacing the quiet suburban mornings he had once taken for granted. If he thought of the balcony, or the woman who had fought him there, he gave no indication. The image of that balcony remained fixed in the collective memory of the investigation. In archival photographs from 1970, it stood open to the night, sheer curtains lifted by a breeze, a rectangle of darkness beyond. Now in the mind's eye it merged with another image, the heavy steel door of a prison cell swinging shut, its lock engaging with a hollow, resonant click. For half a century, a sliver of skin under a young woman's fingernail held a name. All it needed was time.